Okay, hopefully we are back and that wasn't too bad of a skip. Um, slides 18 and 19, well, 18, 17 and 18, I talk about this cooperative mission, right, where we're trying to find things that I'm not forcing you to agree with me on the Bible, right? I can't do that. I can't take someone that wasn't raised in a Christian culture and have that be a basis, right? That's just not going to work. But it doesn't matter what religion you're from, you understand that people have an experience and seek self esteem, right? Like, and if you're from a culture that, we'll see what happens when someone is from a culture where they don't believe, say, gay people or women or Africans, people of African descent, right? That they don't deserve the same rights because they shouldn't seek. That's going to be a problem. A person like that is not going to be allowed at the cooperative table. It's not like just any views are allowed. It's not radical tolerance. We need rational basis, and that rational basis is an understanding of human experience. And black people have human experience too, and so do gay people, and so do women. And so their experience matters just as much as mine does. And that recognition is essential to this project of cooperation. Okay, so the cooperation is how we form the sense of we. And so on slide 19, I've got a bunch of things. At least look briefly at the social identity theory stuff. You don't have to watch the entire denial of death video, though I really think you should. It is amazing. It is really good. And I teach it, we watch it every time I teach 101 or Common Core 104, because it's really important to understand how humans join together into communities and form we's and why we do that. And then there's stuff there about social identity theory, how our identity comes from the we, from the group that we're a part of, and then conformity experiment, how the group that we're a part of can influence our beliefs. That turns out the people that are around us have a massive influence over what we believe. Okay. Slide 20, we get to the next section of Russon family. This runs through, I think it is 69, where it starts social life, and then that runs through 74, which is the end of the chapter. So the next section is family. First thing he shows us is that it is essential to figure out how we relate to and deal with others to figure out who we are. Because as we've seen in the Milgram experiment, as we've seen in social identity theory, as we see in the Stanford prison experiment, the people around us have a massive influence over who we are. Okay, read paragraph on page 61. Right, just, the sense of who we are, the sense that we matter. All of this happens in the context of these others. So make sure to read that paragraph on 61. Slide 21, right? Really important stuff. The family is where we initially get our role. We matter insofar as we contribute to, is a good way to put it, right? Continue that narrative, right? You're a good son, Jesse, because you continue the narrative of the Bailey family. This is how we do it, and a good son does these things. This is your role, and your value is in contributing to these things. And so, 61 through on to several pages, 61 through 64, really. He has a lot of stuff from the Greeks and Romeo and Juliet and La Cosa Nostra and like all this stuff about the importance of family. It's certainly a little bit less important in modern American culture, but I mean, a lot of you are probably of Italian descent. It's still centrally important in our lives. And so it needs to be really understood as the background, what he's going to call the clearing later on. And so on top 65, as we saw, this is very top of page 65, and we're on slide 22. As we saw, establishing a secure sense of self comes with establishing a shared intersubjective sense of the nature of reality. What is real? What matters? What are the values, right? It is thus through the support of other people that we are able to become familiar with the world, right? They teach, Daddy, what's that? That's a black person. Stay away from them. Daddy, what's that? That's a white person. Don't trust whitey, right? You learn about the world, but what's real? You learn about the nature of things, right? By that, from within the development of that family. You don't challenge that initially. We'll talk about how those challenges happen. So that family presents the background, the clearing, as he says there on 75, against which we learn to develop a sense of self. A sense of self that hopefully someday will be able to criticize that family and form its own way of life and not just simply repeat the patterns of our parents. Okay, and this is what we get at the bottom of slide 22 and on to slide 23. It's the background, but it's not fully determinative. This is where Freud is wrong. This is where Freud and Marx and Deleuze and Guattari are wrong. The family is a huge influence over who we are, but every human being goes through a teenage years of rebellion, right? It is the natural trajectory of a human being to take the determinacies of their family and their culture and their background and their socialization and challenge it. You make it your own, you overcome it, you form your own individual life. You don't ever get rid of it. I don't ever, ask yourself, could you suddenly become a Muslim terrorist? Is that path of your future open for you? Probably not. I don't know y'all that well, but it's probably not an open path for you. But you realize that had you been born into a different family, in a different society, that would be like a possibility for you. Like that would be a choice. There'd be forces and energies pushing you in that direction. So we're never going to get to go back and reform ourselves and just make anything possible where we're radically free to create ourselves. That's true. Deleuze and Guattari and Marx and Freud were right about that. But that doesn't mean we're fully determined. That just is the background. The fact that I'm a 6-foot-tall white male has a huge amount to do with who I am, but it's not fully determinative, right? That is the background, that influences. It's always present, it's always there, but that doesn't determine who I am. That's the clearing in which a certain number of future possibilities are open to me and a bunch of others are closed off. There's a bunch of marginal ones which would be very, very, very hard for me, but I could still do them. And then there's a bunch of things like becoming a Muslim terrorist that's just completely impossible based on my embodiment and my past and my society and my class background, etc. Okay. The family operates like this. The family is that clearing that doesn't fully determine who we are. Why not? Because we're human. That's not a relativistic claim. Because, objectively true, because we are human, we are not fully determined by our family background. Why? Because the whole structure, the natural structure of the family is to get the child to obey, but to obey so that they can grow up and stop obeying, so that they can no longer just behave in the ways that their family does because they're following rules like a ritual. We're raising that child to become an adult. We're raising that child to become a parent. We're telling them to obey the rules, but the goal is to get them to make their own rules. So this is the structure that we need to understand. Okay. So, so we start in here's the problem, right? Initially, 66 and 67, right? This is where we get this account of how, and this is on slide 23 and 24. This is the major influence, the massive influence that the family narrative and the familiar has on us. However, so this is on page 67. Though there are historical situations in which this need not be true, in the modern world the family exists in a social situation contextualized by relations with other people who do not belong to the family. They have their own families. Even as for each of us our family defines itself as the definitive sphere of human relations, it also has the function of opening us out onto other human situations. As much then as our identities are constitutively defined by a relation with familial others, our identities are constructed by an opening out onto non-familiar others. Emerging as a human subject, no matter where you are, is thus to be initiated into a world defined by a double openness of relations to familiars and relations to strangers. These are the initial axes of intersubjective life. There's the us, the we, that's initially the family, but then there's a contact with these strangers that are out there. They're the other families. If we're a tribe, we're all kind of the we, right? And then there are other tribes that we like trade with, and like obviously I'm going to marry one of their daughters so we don't have too much inbreeding going on, right? Or if I'm living in New York City, The neighbors are another we, and I have like a weird relationship to their kid and they speak a different language or something like that, right? And this is 67, the next paragraph. Strangers do not stay strangers, however. The relations we set up with strangers initiate new forms of relationship that in various ways supersede and override family relations. The very nature of the family, is that it opens us to an intersubjective horizon in which who we and our family members are is subject to redefinition. Just as the developing of the habits that was made possible by our initial bodily openings redefines the significance and nature of those initial bodily openings. So let's consider this redefinition, right? This is what's going to happen on slide 25, but you need to see this analogy first. Initially, I have my way as an embodied being of doing things. That is contextualized within the family, but just insofar as I'm doing things and behaving and carrying myself in a certain way, and I have a manly posture and a woman has a womanly posture and tilts her head and all those things that we saw, right? All that is open to view. All of that is open to the judgment of others. And while within the family, it kind of determines that the girl carries herself like this and the boy carries herself like this and he dresses this way and all those roles and all the behaviors and all the stuff you're supposed to do are determined within that family, the very structure of that embodiment is to be open to different views and specifically views on us. Let me give you, so that's all very complicated, let me give you a very direct example. So the uncle that had an abusive relationship, he was a real asshole. Real, it's like super mega asshole. And I know his 3 sons very well. They're my cousins. And one of them I spent a lot of time with, and I remember him being a real hothead. I remember one time he was driving me back from, I was just like 12 and he was like 20. And we were driving back from my grandfather's funeral, and he gets stuck in traffic and he just starts getting angrier and angry and starts peeling out and like drives around the shoulder. And I'm just like sitting there terrified, thinking I'm going to die, because he's unbelievably out of control of his anger. And that's because his dad was an asshole and rewarded that behavior. My cousin has told me stories about like going to restaurants, and if your food is a little bit late or wrong or something, you're just openly rude to the waitress. That's just what he did. That's how he dealt with waitresses. And so when he, the little 8-year-old, would be like, "This isn't what I ordered. What's wrong with you?" Dad would like just maybe not explicitly say, "Good job, son, way to make demands. You're a man, you should make demands and tell people how it's going to be. And if it's not right, you tell them make it right. And that's just what you got to do to make it in this world." He may not have explicitly given that speech, though he probably did. But just in his posture toward the son being rude to the waitress, it's a rewarding, right? The kid's embodiment as a rude, angry, moody person is rewarded by the relationship. If I tried that, my dad would just be like, "Did you just talk to an adult that way?" And he would grab me by my ear and drag me out to the car, and I'd be sitting in the car while everybody else ate in the restaurant. And it would be really immediately clear that that was unacceptable behavior in this we, right? The we that's the family. He came from a different family. So I hang out with him when he's 20, he's got a super hot head. I hang out with him much later in life, and he's totally mellow. He's completely changed his relationship to the world. And one night we're driving across Texas, we're going backpacking, and I actually asked him about this. I'm like 21 myself at the time, and I'm like, "It's interesting. I remember you being a hell of a hothead. Like, what happened?" And he said, "Well, my dad was kind of an asshole. I went away to college as far as he could. He went from Connecticut to Seattle, Washington for college. And he was hanging out with some friends, and like a pizza or something. They ordered pizza. I don't remember the story. Like they ordered a pizza or something. It comes late. He gets up, opens the door. "Where the hell have you been?" And all of his friends are just like, "Hey, man, chill out. It's 10 minutes late, man. Relax." And he starts watching this new group of people and sees, and this is how he put it. This is in his words. "I went off to college and I realized there was another way to react to things." That's how he put it. That he had this is just how you react. You get angry if your pizza's late. When he sees these people, this new other group of others, these strangers, these unfamiliar people behaving in unfamiliar ways, they're initially strange and foreign, but what they present to him is a new possibility. That stranger becomes a familiar. Right? We move from the family to the social life, and this gives us the opportunity to create new forms of life and new forms of identity. Isn't as simple a thing as our emotional reactions to the things around us? Okay? That's a concrete example of how we just in our nature as embodied beings encounter others. And those others, they're viewed to us, they're different, and they are destined to not remain strangers. They're destined to be understood. And in that understanding, we develop new possibilities for ourselves or develop possibilities of criticism where we say, ooh, yeah, I'm encountering you as another, and your way of doing things really sucks. It's repressive and it's too angry or whatever it is. It's unhealthy. And I'm to describe on a rational basis why you should try to be more like me and my family, right? Either one of those becomes possible when there's contact and conversation, when the stranger and the unfamiliar isn't automatically ostracized, but is thought through and understood. This path where the strangers no longer are strangers, which allows for the redefinition of who we are and who our family is and who the we is, that natural redefinition where the we is initially just the family and then it's a little bit wider and then it's the whole society and then maybe it's all Americans and then hopefully the we could be all human beings, right? With that redefinition of who the we is and the place of the family and the individual in it is just what humans do. If humans are stopped from doing this, there's something wrong. Okay, that should make sense. So he says on 67, let's look at how this redefinition occurs. Right? And there's a basic structure here. This is 67 and 68. And this is the structure of what it means to be a child. So I've mentioned this already, slide 26 and 20, 25, 26, 27. All kind of hopefully make this pretty clear, basic structure. I raise my kid to be an obedient follower of rules. I want him to follow my rules. But my goal is to have him rebel. My goal is to have that child rebel against those rules, look for different ways to do things, go out there and experience different ways of doing things, and then make their own rules. I don't want my kid's life to be exactly the same as my life. I don't want their ideas to be exactly the same as my ideas. I don't want their family traditions to be the exact same as my family traditions. I want them to grow up and be their own individual. And that is the trajectory of raising a child. We raise a child, we force them to obey, but their goal is to not have them obey, to have them participate as rational agents. And this is a really important distinction. Are we following the rules of our society just because that's how it's done? Or that's how it's always been done? Come here, kitty. Or are we following the rules of the society because we understand them, we agree that they're rational, we agree that they're a good practice, and we're participating in them consciously? These are completely different ways of participating in social life and in these rules that govern the we. Initially, we don't explain to the child why they have to eat their vegetables and go to bed at 9:30 and sit around the table and pray before they eat or whatever it is. We don't explain it to them. They just have to do it because they're part of our family and this is how we do it and this is how it's done. But our goal is to have that not be the case. Our goal is to have them understand and form their own traditions. So there's that trajectory of human life. Right? That trajectory of human life, its goal is for the individual to form their own identity and a stable sense of themselves. Okay, so I'm going to click it off now because we got to page 69, and we'll do social life next. It's not stopping, so just give it. Okay, hopefully this is back. So yeah, so we ended on slide 27, right? Trying to understand how we go from being a child to an adult and how this is inherent to the logic of being a human being. So this is something hopefully we can all agree on, that you start off, maybe it's not your parents, like he's very clear, you can be an orphan or raised in a society where you're not raised by your parents or in a tribe or whatever, but you go from participating in a set of rules, which the world just demands that you follow, and you have no idea why, to being an active, rational part of that. That this is basic to the fundamental struggle of trying to develop a sense of who we are. And this always happens, as we know, in the context of others, in the context of I am a part of this we. Okay, so slide 28, very, very, very important. transition from family life to social life, right? This is what this next section, starting on 69, these next 5 pages is all about. And it's important that you read this very carefully and understand it. First, he makes it clear this can take a lot of different forms. And the basic dialectic of this is there are certain societies in which the family structure pretty exactly mirrors the structure of the wider society, right? So we have a small town in Texas where the person grows up and moving from being a teenager playing high school in this tiny little town, they just move down the street from their parents and they do the exact same thing as their parents. They live in the same kind of house and do the same job, and their kids go to the same high school and also play high school football, and they're just kind of repeating it because the broader society mirrors the narrative of the family. Right, the little story that the family tells about what it means to be a man. The kid goes off to high school, and hey, everybody agrees with him, and the entire society and everyone in the town is like, "You're a good boy. You're raising your boy right, right." And so everybody kind of agrees, and so there's a real smooth transition. We might think of someone in a tribal situation where all the families are all up in each other's business and they're all living together, and the story that the family tells about who we are is exactly the same as the rest of the tribe, and they all live together. So there's a very smooth transition from childhood to adulthood, often in that situation marked by a ritual where you become a man, right? You become an adult as going through this some kind of rite of passage, right? But it's seamless. There's no trouble. You don't have to struggle to find your sense of yourself because you've always known who you are. The who you are that was given to you by your family was just simply repeated in that society. So it's super simple. Other side of things might be something like growing up in New York City and, or Toronto or some cosmopolitan environment in which there's a million different options, right? Or maybe even a more extreme, the example I give on, I think, slide 29, yes, is what if you're raised, I had a friend, sort of friend, neighbor, that was raised Seventh-day Adventist. And she had never heard a rock and roll song. She'd never heard who didn't know who Bob Dylan was. She'd never worn colored clothing. They only wore like black and gray and white, or there was like 4 colors they could wear. Like really, really, really different from the wider California culture. And her transition from being raised in that community to being a member of social life with a completely different narrative about what a woman could accomplish and what her role was, right? That transition was very difficult for her. And as a result, she made a lot of mistakes and had a hard time because she wasn't prepared by her family for life in the larger social world. And that's one of the things we have to do as parents, is not just to tell our kids this is what you do in our private little tiny family community, but to also give them the tools to be successful and to easily navigate the broader social world. Okay, so those are 2 very different ways. One of them, the first one, tribal structure, seamless transition into social life. The other one, where you're living in a little micro community and the family is very different and doesn't repeat the structure, the narrative society at all. Maybe it says the narrative society is bankrupt or evil in some way. And so the transition there is very, very difficult. Nevertheless, even in these radically different situations, there's still this transition taking place. Okay, so page 70, description about the narratives that society has. Hopefully this makes sense. The society tells us a story about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, right? We have stories about things. And then there's some question about how we participate in those stories. First thing is, on page 70, the customs and traditions of our society are not asking us to agree. They're not asking for our consent. We're just expected to go along with it. He goes further, even saying that unless you do that initially as a child, you'll never even have a cultural basis from which to criticize any culture or any cultural form. So you have to enter into these traditions at first. But at first, we don't know why we're doing them, right? We don't know why. We just conform. And we kind of have to if we don't want to get ostracized. And so I got a little joke about reindeer, right? So poor little Rudolph, they won't let him play in anybody's reindeer games because he's different, right? And so we don't want to be different. We don't want to be bullied. We don't want to be picked on or ostracized. And so we're forced to conform. We're just going to do things the way they're done. And we don't understand why they're that way. We just do it so that we don't stand out. And so conformity makes sense, right? So this is slide 32. It makes sense to conform. What we want is for our interpretation and embodiment and our hopes and dreams and our temporal life to be rewarded with praise. We want people to say, your interpretations of what's valuable are the right interpretations, right? The way you dress, amazing. The way your body looks, great. Your posture, the way you carry yourself, your sense of humor, your sense of physicality, perfect. You're not too aggressive and you're not too shy. You're perfect. And that's what we want. That's what we want is people around us who we respect and who know us, right? We want them to tell us that we're valuable. Well, if we're in a community that has a bunch of very powerful judgments about these things, and we want our judgments and way we carry ourselves to be, praised, that we just dress the way they dress. Do what they do. Make the same claims. They say something's good, we say it's good. They say something's evil, we say it's evil. And lo and behold, everyone around us is like, you're pretty awesome. And so conformity makes sense, right? A kid's a super badass athlete. He's not going to play cricket if he grew up in a small Texas town. He's going to play football because football is that sport that's going to get him chicks, right? That's what he wants. He wants to live in such a way that he's not ostracized, not bullied, not pushed off to the side. But it's not that simple, right? That is all true, but there's also a natural structure of resistance. We also have this logic of the cool person, right? The cool person doesn't just do what everybody else does. They push the limits in certain ways, right? We challenge the rules. Kid doesn't just repeat the narrative of the family. They rebel. So conformity dominates the huge, 99%, huge percentage of human behavior and just humans in general. But we're always just striving to stand out a little bit, right? To not simply be the same as everyone else. We have this need to rebel and to be an individual and to march to the beat of our own drummer and all those cliches, right? So it's not just a drive to conformity, though that drive to conformity makes sense, and it makes sense why so many people are conformists. But we also have this teenage year. These teenage years, right, which are about the challenge to that, rebelling against that authority, trying to find our own way. The first problem, slide 34, this gets commodified, right? Companies try to sell us our identity. And so, how many advertisements have you seen that are like, be different, be an individual, stand out from the crowd, buy this product? All the time. Right? This is a really common technique because people have this feeling, this need, this desire to stand out. And so slide 36, you can read this on your own. We have, along with the need to conform, we also have this need for individualism, and so they find ways to commodify that. Okay, hopefully that all makes sense. So 37. Slide 37. So we experience this demand to conform. Sometimes it's very powerful. If we don't conform, we get thrown in jail. Sometimes it's less serious, right? But the goal is that we find a genuine sense of ourself, a genuine sense of individuality. This is going to be really hard for a gay person in Uganda, where you can go to death. They will put you in jail and put you to death if they catch you being gay. Right? It's going to be really hard for that gay person to find a stable sense of self in that community. Right? They're going to still have to, that's their struggle, that's still their goal, that's still their purpose in life. It's just going to be really, really hard. It's really, really hard for people in North Korea or a woman in the Taliban, right? They're repressive. They're repressive. Those communities are repressive of this need to find our own way, which is the natural trajectory of becoming an adult. This isn't just how we do it in America. This isn't just how we do it in the West. This is the natural structure of human life, to go from being a child to being an adult. And the adult doesn't just conform because they're forced to. The adult finds their own way and their own sense of self, negotiating from out of that clearing that their family and that their society provide for them, but that doesn't fully determine who they are. Even if they're in North Korea, they have these private parts of their mind, and they're writing poetry and then burning it and these kinds of things, and whispering that Kim Jong-il's a total dick, right? And they whisper this to one another, but don't tell anyone. And so even there, you've got your own individuality, you've got your own methods of rebellion. They're just incredibly severely repressed. And in that repression, we're seeing a repression of human nature, of what it means to be human, which is striving for this sense of individuality. And thus, these repressive societies aren't just counter to my Western bias. They're counter to the nature of human experience. This is very important. Okay. So 2 things follow from this. On slide 38, I think I make this pretty clear. Russon's claim is that these repressive societies are wrong and that is not relativistic. They're not, well, I say their society is wrong and they say American society is wrong, and who's to say who's right? Well, it's the one who understands humans that's right. And they don't understand humans if they think humans can be treated the way they treat women. Or in North Korea, if they understand humans can be treated, put in jail for their beliefs and for speaking their mind and for thinking freely and seeking the truth, right? If they put people to death the way Socrates was put to death, they have not evolved, and they are wrong, and that's not just from my perspective. They don't understand the truth, right? So it's not relativistic. Second, we can learn something about the proper structure of human society from this. If you look on page 72, he outlines what this is. We'll get to that in a minute. And you might remember that when we did the video for the introduction, that's page 72 is where I asked you to look, and I read a little bit of it, and it didn't make any sense. Well, now hopefully it makes sense. Now that we've gone through this whole path of learning, you can see why he couldn't just say that at the beginning. You had to build up and build up and build up to understanding why this is human experience, to see that he's not just making this up, that this is a true description of who we are. Okay, so what would this society look like? Well, he says on 71 and 72 that this society is not going to be the kind of traditional society which demands conformity, where we behave like we're supposed to behave, like our grandparents behaved, just because it's demanded of us, and there are structures of enforcement which force us to behave. That's not going to be it. It's going to be open to the human structure. So, slide 40, hugely bold claim. The goal of human society is to develop this structure that he's outlining here in this book. So this is page 72. So the terminus ad quem, the goal, inherent goal of human society and intersubjective life. What would its narrative be? What is the story? Basically, its narrative would have to be the very narrative articulated in the preceding pages. It would have to advocate universality for a human population recognized to be creating itself, we're creating ourselves, as networks of self-transcending intersubjective contacts from out of specifically figured situations of social familiarity. Remember, maybe that sentence still doesn't make sense. Let's break it down. Everyone, universally, is involved in this struggle to develop a sense of self. What is that sense of self? Creating itself out of networks of self-transcending intersubjective contacts. What is a self-transcending intersubjective contact? You as child. That is an intersubjective contact that on its own transcends. If you continue being daddy's little girl when you're 60 and never taking any responsibility for your own life, you're fighting the natural structure of life, which is to transcend that childishness and to become an adult. The intersubjective contact which treats someone that's, let's say it's a gay person I've never met, never been around gay people, there's an intersubjective contact there which is foreign and strange and unfamiliar, and they're a stranger. That contact will lead to them not being strange anymore, right? It's self-transcending intersubjective contact. Initially, those things which are strange and other become familiar, become part of the world. We travel, we see different ways of doing things, we read books, we watch different movies, we get out of our tiny little town in Texas, and we see the world. Self-transcending forms of intersubjective contact that allow us to become more and to create ourselves, okay? From out of specifically figured situations of social familiarity. Whatever the figures are, if we're a tribe, It's going to be really hard. If we're in the Taliban, that structure of social familiarity, that how everything is familiar for the Taliban, anything unfamiliar gets immediately beheaded. A little 14-year-old girl like Malala, we'll get to that in a minute, who does something unfamiliar. It's unfamiliar for a 14-year-old girl to say women should be educated in our culture. They should be allowed to leave the house on their own and go to school and learn to read and write and walk around in the streets on their own without an escort. That's an unfamiliar sight for the Taliban, and how do they react to it? They shoot it with an AK-47 because they are douchebags, right? So out of that particular familiarity, it's got to transcend. It's got to be allowed to transcend. Our account, this is continuing on 72, our account allows us to see the necessity that human life be structured by specially figured social familiarities. That is, we can understand why it makes sense that each one of us is embodied in a specific set of narrative practices, and we can see how these different practices are in fact, right, we all start out somewhere, some history, some tradition, some narrative of who we are, and we can see how these different practices are in fact roots by which, and in fact the only roots by which, individuals can develop for themselves both a self-identity and a sense of that self-identity. That we start out just being the child, but then to develop a sense of who we are, we have to transcend that. We go through a rebellious period, we try out being a goth for a while, we try out different identities, finally figuring out who we are. And to get not just that identity, but a sense of that identity. We're aware of who we are and how we're involved in structuring ourselves and making our own lives and rehabituating ourselves and seeking out contact with new, unfamiliar things so that we can become better human beings. If this is the human condition, if this is in fact human condition, if this is human experience, if he's right, then the society that is universally open to the human condition must be one that accepts this necessity of social diversity as its premise. Difference and diversity as a premise of the structure of the terminus ad quem, the goal inherent in human society. As far as society is that place in which we reach intersubjective contact outside of our families, it should take this narrative as its definitive structure. And it should allow for those differences, right? The universal society then is one that acknowledges the experiential primacy of cultural pluralism, of narrative pluralism, and sees the universality of any shared human environment as something to be achieved through learning to make such narratives communicate rather than as a given, already existent situation of human equality. Right? We have to then learn to communicate. That the narrative of how we behave has to justify itself. Right? And so this is the next very important step. Right? This is the proper structure of human society, the one that takes this narrative as seeking a sense of self and allowing as many individuals in that society as possible to develop that self-esteem and happiness, going their own way. Right? So what does this mean? Look on slide 41, right? Let's say I grew up in a small Texas town and I encounter something as foreign. It's a gay person, right? And then I learn about that and I say, hey, wait a minute. He shouldn't be oppressed. He should not be oppressed for who he loves. He shouldn't have to be scared. He should be able to be proud of who he is. We see that teen self-esteem in gay teens in America is extraordinarily low. Suicide rates are still very high. They are dropping to a certain extent, but they're still ridiculously high, and that's shameful. The proper structure of society is one in which there's a pluralism, right? There are multiple ways of forming a sense of self where someone wouldn't have to be in a closet because there'd be a role for them, right? And we're getting better. We're getting better there. We've got more gay characters on TV. They're a little stereotyped, obviously, but there are paths open that were closed before, and so we're doing better, and we've got to continue moving in that direction. Okay. Now, does this mean, slide 42 and on to page 73 and 74, does this mean then that since what we have to be is open to communication with others, that this is just tolerance, right? There are lots of differences and you have to tolerate difference. You've heard this from your elementary school teachers. You see this on TV. You see this in the Hallmark cards, that you have to be tolerant of difference. Russon thinks that's bullshit. You tolerate cockroaches in the summer. You tolerate cold in the winter. You tolerate things that are terrible, but you can't deal with. I don't want you to tolerate gay people. I want you to respect gay people. I don't want you to tolerate Muslims. If you're a Christian, be like, oh, those damn Muslims, but I guess I have to tolerate those horrible people. No, I don't want you to tolerate them. I want you to understand their tradition, right? I want you to talk to them. I want you to read about them. I want you to learn about them and make that initially foreign thing seem less foreign and less strange. You seek to understand this intersubjective other that you're in contact with. Why? That gives us the ability to not tolerate certain things, right? We've given a story about the proper structure of human society, that it's one that allows for freedom of individual expression. If you encounter a society who's structured in a different way, like Taliban or North Korea or Uganda, you don't have to tolerate that. You can say, no, it is wrong for you to not educate girls and to have them married off to people they don't know when they're 13 and to have no control over their lives. That's wrong. And it's wrong because it's counter to this human narrative. So I'm open to pluralism. I'm open to multiple ways of existing. But I now listen to you. I understand where you're coming from, and now allow me to offer a sort of criticism. But that criticism has to come internal to their discourse, right? So we have to understand where they're coming from. We have to understand their narratives in order to structure a criticism. So I can be critical of the Taliban, but not because, oh, those damn Talibans and their turbans and their damn Muslims and they bombed us on 9/11 and I'm a super racist and I'm a jackass. That's not the proper structure of a criticism. The criticism has to come from inside. And so when we criticize the Taliban, we have to echo the words of Malala. Click on that clip, watch that interview. This girl is amazing. She's just one of the most amazing people ever. And she's critical of the Taliban from within that structure. She's an Afghan kid. And she's critical of that. That's what the voice that we need to support. I'm asking you to be open to difference. I'm asking you to seek to understand the unfamiliar. And I'm telling you that that's the natural trajectory of human life and of human society, to go from a private little family of we to finally more people are we, including people in Afghanistan. Yes, including the Afghanistan people, not bombing them. No, understanding them as part of the we, us, humans, seeking self-esteem, seeking identity. But as soon as that person over there in Afghanistan decides that his way of communicating is not to sit down and speak rationally through philosophical speech and rational discussion about how human life and social life should be structured, but rather to shoot 14-year-old girls, we now no longer have to be tolerant, right? We don't have to tolerate that and be like, well, that's his way of expressing it. No. Because we have principles that we've agreed on. Those principles are defined by human experience. We didn't make them up in the West. We didn't come up with them and then enforce them throughout the world through cultural hegemony. We discovered the eternal, unchanging truth of the human condition, which is the struggle for identity and individuality and self-esteem. That's just what we're doing as human beings. That's our journey here. And out of that narrative, we can then be critical of any society that's so repressive that that their people are not allowed to develop individuality, that they're like North Korea, like in the Taliban, they are forced to conform to tradition rather than being allowed to find their own way, to take up those traditions, to alter those traditions, to modify, to those traditions evolve through time. That evolution, that freedom, that liberality of culture is in fact the goal. That's the proper structure, not the one that demands obedience. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. So, in this structure, so that's the proper structure of human society, according to Russon. It's a hell of a bold claim, which allows us to be non-relativistically critical of other structures of society that don't live up to this. That's on the basis of an understanding of how social life should work, the logic, the inherent life of what it means to be part of a we that's a social we, which is based in an understanding of how families are the initial we out of which we make contact with other human beings, the strangers. which is a result of understanding how the family is that source in which our own interpretive embodiment, relation to others, our temporal structure, our past, our habits, our future, our goals, all those things that the first 3 chapters outline, those things are developed in the context of that family. So it all goes back to this development of human experience that we see in every moment. You're experiencing it right now as you try to make sense of these lectures. You're doing it right now in your life. You see it. So like Descartes' cogito, where he says, okay, you need to do this for yourself. You need to see, this is the structure of my consciousness. I think, therefore I am. You're agreeing to it because you see it immediately. I'm agreeing to it, and now let's have that thing that no one can disagree on, be a foundation for us to build a narrative about what's true and about what kind of lives we should live, etc. Descartes built his. It's kind of ridiculous. There's some bad moves in there. Because when I do this work, Russon, I come up with what Russon comes up with. I don't find myself in isolated consciousness. I find myself involved with my wife and my parents and my society, and I find myself in a body, and I find out that my race is important and my gender is important, and being a 6-foot-tall white male has a huge heterosexual white male born in Texas to a Marine father. That's what I find when I look in here, not a disembodied mind. And so starting with that, if you do it too, and then this person doesn't, and this person doesn't. And if everybody goes through this philosophical work of discovering that we're all involved in this experience and that this experience has a natural trajectory of seeking a stable sense of self and self-esteem, and thus on that basis, happiness, if we can all agree on that, then that becomes the new cogito, right? That becomes the foundation on which we can build an account of the proper structure of society and how society should relate to one another and how to raise our kids and how our families should be structured, etc., etc., etc. Russon says that this is what he gets from studying the last 200 years of continental philosophy. He says that there are insights into what it means to be human. A lot of those insights sound like they're reductive of human autonomy. We've discovered an enormous number of insights into our experience that make it look like we're determined by where we grew up, we're determined by our family, we're determined by our community and social indoctrination, which, if you recall back, was a threat to philosophy all the way back with Plato. Right? Socrates was concerned that social indoctrination was fully determinative of who we are. And we've seen a bunch of stuff from that Russon is calling up from the last 200 years of continental philosophy and psychology and anthropology and sociology that seem to claim, yeah, you're not free. But we've also seen there are paths of resistance. There are paths written into our nature of rebellion and self-creation, where we can find the tools to create ourselves. The understanding of how to create a society in which those tools are present and available so that people of different sexualities and different races and different genders and different class backgrounds can all involve themselves in this development of the self, involve themselves, right, to make this their new narrative. That there's not just a formation of self, but a sense of that formation of the self. That's philosophy. Where we're not just doing it, where we're reflecting on doing it and writing books like this and having these conversations where we're talking about our desires, our needs, our drive, our trajectory of developing a sense of ourselves. And from all the different ways we do it, and somebody's doing it from over here and they were a poor black kid, with a single parent home, and I'm a, upper middle class white kid with both parents, and we have a conversation about how freaking different our experience is. But how the same our experience, or where they connect, how we're both looking for the same kinds of things, right? The same sense of self. We're doing this conversation in order to say, no, Marx and Freud and Deleuze and Guattari, you're wrong. They're massively influenced by that background. But the very narrative of human life, looking at the 200 years of the history of continental philosophy, we discover there are paths of resistance because the very narrative of human life is to overcome those limitations and to create ourselves. Now hopefully that makes sense. That needs to make sense. That's the punchline. That's the important point. Chapter 6 is about philosophy. Chapter 6 is called philosophy because it's like, this is what it means to sit down and have not just be seeking self-esteem, but to be theorizing about self-esteem and talking about what should society look like if we're going to have people with self-esteem in it. And we've seen that racist policemen don't help, right? Homophobic policies don't help. Right? There are a number of things that don't help on the basis of the rational thing that we're trying to seek self-esteem. So philosophy is that conversation. But before it gets to chapter 6, we get chapter 5, and that's the next chapter. What is it? Chapter 5 is about neurosis. Neurosis is what happens when these paths of movement from the stable sense of self that we have within the we of the family hits a bunch of a variety of roadblocks along the way and is incapable of seamlessly integrating its own narrative into the narrative of society. So maybe we have someone who was raised by a parent that was just coddled them and told them they were the greatest thing ever and they could do no wrong. And then they go out into society and society tells them, no, you're not the most amazing little snowflake in the world. You suck at things and you have to accomplish things. And the kid becomes so incapable that they just don't try anything because they're terrified of failure because they have no way of dealing psychologically with failure because their parents never told them, no, do it again, do it harder, keep trying. You have to do better, right? That kind of discipline that he needed, he never got. So he goes out in society and he can't handle things. Or maybe his parent, right? That's going to be a kind of neurosis, which results in this child not being able to take any risks in trying anything. Right? Throughout chapter 5, he'll be chronicling different forms of times where they're not able to integrate into society. One of his grad students, and I'll be talking about this in the next video after Christmas, talks about agoraphobia, a person who becomes so anxious in unfamiliar territory that they eventually basically never leave their house. Maybe they'll go out to the grocery store, go out to one restaurant, but they just stay in their little world because they're anxious. And we've all been there. You felt anxious in unfamiliar territory, right? You go to a party and it's a bunch of people that are not from your social group and you're just really nervous and standing in the corner and somebody comes up to you and is like, hey bro, you having a good time? What's up, bro? And slaps you on the shoulder and you're like, is this guy about to kick my ass? Am I about to be in a fight here or is this guy being nice and welcoming? I honestly have no idea. I'm anxious. I'm going to leave. Right? We've been anxious like that. That's a kind of tiny little miniature neurosis where we're not comfortable somewhere. If that's our situation every time we're, say, talking to girls or out in the world, if we're that anxious, that's a serious neurosis, right? And that's an inability to understand how to integrate ourselves into society. There are a million different forms of this: eating disorders, sexual dysfunctions, a bunch of them that he goes through in chapter 5. All of which are this kind of interlude between chapter 4 telling us what the proper structure of human life is, developing this trajectory and stable sense of self so we can operate seamlessly in the world, versus this other kind of life, which doesn't quite pull it off. Okay, so that was hopefully enough of a primer for chapter 5.